Welcome to Dark History for Sleep, where the past is not just remembered but relived. Tonight you're not just hearing a story, you're stepping into it. You are a peasant in Soviet Ukraine. You own land, not much, but enough to live. You have children, a cow, some grain stored for winter. You know the soil, you fear the state, but you don't know what's coming, because hunger isn't the first weapon. Identification is, before a single Ukrainian starved, before the fields emptied, before the ovens burned tree bark for bread, Stalin needed a new enemy, not foreigners, not dissidents, but people like you, those who could feed others without the state. By 1929, the Soviet Union had declared war on its own food supply. The plan: to collectivize agriculture. Private farms would become state-controlled collectives. Livestock, grain, even your tools, all now belonged to the people. In theory. In reality, it meant Moscow. A new word began to spread like rot. Kulak. It meant enemy. Greedy, hoarder, saboteur. It didn't matter if you were none of those things. All it took was owning one cow too many, or one jealous neighbor's whisper. Then the knock at the door came. They arrived at night. Sometimes soldiers, sometimes party officials in leather coats. They read your name from a crumpled list. Your crime, success, resisting collectivization, asking why your fields had been taken. You weren't arrested, you were disappeared. Some were loaded onto freight trains with no heat, no water, and no destination. Others were marched into the forest and shot. Entire villages watched as their strongest families were taken, land seized, homes redistributed, livestock slaughtered in the name of revolution. But those who stayed weren't spared, because the grain didn't stay in Ukraine. It was requisitioned, counted, seized. Every kilogram tallied to meet Moscow's quota, and the quotas kept rising. At first, people resisted, secretly. They hid grain under floorboards, buried food in the woods, whispered to neighbors, "Don't let the party see your harvest." But this resistance was known. It was expected. It was punished. Party officials arrived with rifles and notebooks. They scoured attics and ovens. If they found unregistered grain, you were arrested. If they found nothing, they might arrest you anyway. If your village didn't meet its quota, the entire town could be blacklisted. That meant no supplies, no trade, no right to leave. And then, the hunger began. The land still grew food, but not for you. Welcome to the first phase of the Holodomor. Imagine living in a village that has been condemned to die, not with bullets or bombs, but with silence. By 1931, Soviet officials had perfected the mechanism of mass starvation. It wasn't enough to seize the grain. The real power was in punishing entire communities at once. The tool was the blacklist. If your village failed to meet its grain quota, even if the harvest had been poor or the grain had already been taken, you were declared non-compliant. That label meant one thing: starvation. All shops were closed, markets were shut down, officials blocked access to roads, rivers, and railways. There would be no food, no trade, no escape. In the eyes of the state, your entire community was no longer part of the country. You were exiled in place. Children searched ditches for weeds. Mothers begged passing trains to throw them scraps. Old men sat motionless in the snow, and the silence grew. Families didn't cry anymore. There was no strength to cry. In some regions, neighbors stopped speaking altogether. To speak might mean being overheard, being accused, being arrested. There was a new fear now, not just of starvation, but of your own children, your own spouse. Because the state offered rewards for informants, a sack of flour, a place in the collective, an end to suffering, in exchange for a name. People began to disappear in new ways, not to Siberia, but into cellars where they died in secret, into fields where they simply lay down and never rose again, into the statistics of the state where their deaths were never counted as famine. In public, Stalin claimed the plan was working. "There is no famine," he said in 1932. "There is only sabotage." Western journalists, when allowed into the country, were shown model villages, fake markets, carefully staged harvests with smiling peasants. Photographs were taken, articles were written, and the truth stayed buried. Meanwhile, in real Ukraine, death had no drama. It arrived slowly, quietly, unceremoniously. A 10-year-old boy in Cherkasy wrote in a smuggled letter, "My mother made soup from a rat. She gave me all of it. She didn't wake up." That letter never reached the outside world. Most didn't. By winter's end, entire streets in rural towns were empty. Horses and dogs were gone. Trees had been stripped of bark. Boots had been boiled for broth. Children who still walked the roads had sunken eyes and swollen bellies. They didn't ask for bread anymore. They asked if they were going to heaven. By early 1932, the hunger was no longer a condition. It was a presence, a shape in the room. It breathed, it watched, it fed. But the Soviet system still found new ways to make it worse. That year, Stalin introduced a new restriction, the internal passport. This was not a document of travel. It was a tool of entrapment. Without it, you could not legally leave your village. You could not board a train. You could not buy food in a city, even if you had money. And the state refused to issue passports to those in problem areas, especially blacklisted villages in Ukraine. Suddenly, tens of thousands of starving people were trapped. They wandered the countryside, barefoot, emaciated, begging for crumbs. But the roads had checkpoints. Armed guards turned them back. Cities like Kiev were patrolled by militia squads trained to spot the skeletal, the desperate. Those caught without documents were arrested, deported, or dumped at the village border with nothing. Stalin had turned Ukraine into an open-air prison, and inside that prison, reality changed. Food was no longer just scarce. It was mythical. People began to hallucinate it, seeing bread in the clouds, stew in the dirt. They ate sawdust, flower bulbs, pine needles. Entire families dug for worms and roots, knowing they'd die without them. But even worse was what people began to do to each other. A man in Poltava reported finding a woman roasting meat behind her cottage. It smelled strange. When he asked where she got it, she said, "The girl had no family." Her voice was calm. She had boiled her neighbor's child. The Soviet archives hold thousands of similar reports. Cases of cannibalism were so frequent that by 1933, the regime posted signs throughout Ukraine that read, "To eat your own children is a barbaric act," as if the people had simply forgotten. But they hadn't forgotten. They had been starved until human instinct collapsed, until love, protection, even motherhood itself, became warped by the body's demand to survive. And yet Moscow still denied the famine existed. In the cities, party elites held feasts, celebrations of industrial progress, speeches about wheat production, tractor output, proletarian glory. Delegations toasted to a future built by peasants who even now were lying dead in their own kitchens. By spring, reports emerged of corpses clogging rivers, children collapsing on school floors, whole villages reduced to echo. But the trains never stopped leaving Ukraine filled with grain. The quotas had been met. This was not a famine of nature. It was a famine of design. The Soviet state didn't merely allow starvation, it legislated it. In August 1932, the Central Executive Committee passed what would become one of the most lethal decrees in Soviet history, the Law of 5 years of grain. It stated that anyone, child, elderly, starving, who stole even a handful of grain from a field could be executed or imprisoned for 10 years, 5 ears of wheat. The kind a child might pocket for their mother. The kind that once fell to the ground during harvest and was gathered by hand. Now touching it was treason. Thousands were arrested under this law. Children, widows, survivors of deported families. Entire prisons were filled with skeletons. People punished not for theft, but for trying to live. The result was pure psychological terror. No one dared walk near a field. No one shared scraps. Families stopped helping neighbors. Hunger had become a trap with barbed walls. And Stalin's system was now self-reinforcing. The starving policed the starving for fear of becoming next. Meanwhile, in the streets, bodies no longer shocked anyone. In Kharkiv, witnesses described the city square littered with corpses, men who collapsed mid-step, children curled under staircases. They were collected by municipal wagons, dumped in mass graves, or burned. But even in death, the regime remained suspicious. To be registered as a famine victim required official approval, and the Soviet state refused to acknowledge famine. Instead, death certificates listed causes like exhaustion, heart failure, intestinal failure, or simply unknown. Some districts were given quotas for how many people could officially be dead. Once that number was met, even the dying were left off the lists. Truth had become contraband. Teachers instructed children to report if their parents spoke of hunger. Propaganda films showed glowing harvests. Radio programs played music and state speeches while peasants starved beside silent radios, too weak to move. And still grain continued to be exported abroad, not because it was needed, but because admitting hunger meant admitting failure. And Stalin did not fail. By mid-1933, the death toll was mounting by the hour. Ukrainian towns, once full of laughter and livestock, were now ghost zones, where the only movement came from crows and officials with notebooks. A Soviet officer wrote in his diary, "There are no dogs left, no birds in the trees, only people too weak to bury the people." He would later burn the pages. Even as the death toll in Ukraine reached into the millions, the machine didn't slow. It adapted. The famine had broken the body, but now Stalin's government turned to break the mind. Any trace of empathy, rebellion, or remembrance had to be scrubbed clean. The tool? The NKVD, the Soviet secret police. They were everywhere, in every town, every collective farm, every apartment block. Someone was listening. It might be your neighbor, your brother, your wife. Informants were rewarded, sometimes with food, sometimes with protection, sometimes with nothing more than survival. And still they betrayed. A man could be arrested for saying, "The hunger is worse than last week." A woman could be shot for asking, "Where is the bread?" Even mourning the dead became suspicious. Funerals were rare. Cemeteries were overrun. Graves unmarked. The regime didn't just want people to starve. It wanted them to forget they had ever been alive. And when whispers reached the outside world, they were smothered in propaganda. Foreign journalists, carefully chaperoned, were shown thriving farms, Smiling workers, full shelves, photographs of children dancing in traditional dress. One of the most influential was Walter Duranty, the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. In 1933, Duranty wrote, "There is no actual starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition." He knew the truth. He had seen it. But he feared losing access, and so the lie stood. Only a few dared tell the world what was really happening. One of them was Gareth Jones, a young Welsh journalist who slipped past Soviet minders and entered Ukraine alone. What he saw shocked him: empty villages, skeletal survivors, fields of corpses. He published the truth. He wrote, "Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no bread. We are dying.'" But he was discredited, accused of fabrication. He was later kidnapped and murdered in China under mysterious circumstances, some believe by Soviet agents. Back in the USSR, the famine deepened, and yet no word for it existed. The term Holodomor wouldn't be spoken for decades. In official Soviet memory, these years barely happened. The census of 1937 was destroyed. The demographers were executed. Statistics themselves had become a threat. Because if you could count the dead, you might have to admit they were killed. By the summer of 1933, Ukraine had become a graveyard without boundaries. The roads were quiet. Fields went untilled. Children sat on porches with eyes too large for their faces, staring at nothing, waiting for nothing. Estimates now say that between 3.5 and 5 million people had already died. And still, Stalin said nothing. There was no national address, no moment of mourning, no recognition that a third of an entire republic had perished under his watch. The famine didn't end because of conscience. It ended because the objective had been achieved. By mid-1933, collectivization was complete. Resistance was shattered. The independent peasant class, the so-called kulaks, was gone. The farms were now state-run. The land belonged to the party. Ukraine had been broken, and with that, food shipments resumed. Ration cards appeared in villages again. Grain that had once bypassed starving homes now trickled back in. But it was too late. The people it was meant for were already dead. Those who survived were not spared. They were changed. Many had witnessed things that could never be spoken aloud. A mother feeding her child the flesh of a stranger. A brother hiding a scrap of bread from his sister. A priest who buried bodies by the dozen until his own hands gave out. They emerged from the famine with no monuments, no records, and no language to explain what had happened to them. And that was the final cruelty. Because when a crime leaves no name, no grave, and no trial, it doesn't just go unpunished. It becomes a template. Stalin would go on to use the same methods elsewhere. In Kazakhstan, in other parts of the USSR, hunger as weapon, truth as casualty, death as infrastructure. In Ukraine, the famine was followed by silence so total it echoed. Even into the 1980s, survivors whispered only among themselves. Children weren't taught. Books made no mention. The forests where the dead had been dumped became picnic sites. Fields plowed over the bones. And yet even buried, the memory refused to die. Some survivors began writing memoirs in secret, smuggled them abroad, recorded their stories on audio tape. A grandmother's voice trembling as she remembered burying her own child beneath frozen earth. Using a spoon because the ground was too hard. She said, "We didn't cry. Crying uses energy." By the summer of 1933, Ukraine had become a graveyard without boundaries. The roads were quiet. Fields went untilled. Children sat on porches with eyes too large for their faces, staring at nothing, waiting for nothing. Estimates now say that between 3.5 and 5 million people had already died. And still, Stalin said nothing. There was no national address, no moment of mourning, no recognition that a third of an entire republic had perished under his watch. The famine didn't end because of conscience. It ended because the objective had been achieved. By mid-1933, collectivization was complete. Resistance was shattered. The independent peasant class, the so-called kulaks, was gone. The farms were now state-run. The land belonged to the party. Ukraine had been broken, and with that, food shipments resumed. Ration cards appeared in villages again. Grain that had once bypassed starving homes now trickled back in, but it was too late. The people it was meant for were already dead. Those who survived were not spared. They were changed. Many had witnessed things that could never be spoken aloud. A mother feeding her child the flesh of a stranger. A brother hiding a scrap of bread from his sister. A priest who buried bodies by the dozen until his own hands gave out. They emerged from the famine with no monuments, no records, and no language to explain what had happened to them. And that was the final cruelty. Because when a crime leaves no name, no grave, and no trial, it doesn't just go unpunished. It becomes a template. The same strategies would soon be used again in Kazakhstan, in other parts of the Union, hunger as weapon, truth as casualty, death as infrastructure. In Ukraine, the famine was followed by silence so total it echoed. Even into the 1980s, survivors whispered only among themselves. Children weren't taught. Books made no mention. The forests where the dead had been dumped became picnic sites, fields plowed over the bones, and yet even buried, the memory refused to die. Some survivors began writing memoirs in secret, smuggled them abroad, recorded their stories on audio tape. A grandmother's voice, trembling as she remembered burying her own child beneath frozen earth. Using a spoon because the ground was too hard. She said, "We didn't cry. Crying uses energy." Some people still believed they might be saved. In the early months of 1933, thousands of desperate Ukrainians began to write letters, pleas sent to Moscow, to local councils, to newspapers, to strangers abroad. They weren't political. They weren't even angry. They were human voices, scratched in pencil, begging to be seen. One letter, written by a mother from Poltava, read, "We have eaten all that is edible, bark, rats, glue. My daughter sleeps all day because there is no energy to move. I'm not asking for charity. I am asking for mercy." She never received a reply. Another, "Our men are gone. My neighbors are gone. The horses were eaten last winter. We're not enemies of the people. We are the people." These letters were collected by the hundreds, and most were never opened. The government stored them, archived them, classified them, a record of suffering that it refused to acknowledge while it was happening. Others tried to appeal through action. They threw themselves in front of trains, stormed warehouses. Some raided collective farms, hoping to steal enough to feed a child. They were labeled bandits, saboteurs, enemies of progress. Many were executed. Even within families, trust began to rot. Parents were accused by their own children, many of whom had been raised by party ideology, to report disloyalty. If a child overheard a parent mention the word famine, they might mention it at school. It could be the last thing they ever said to them. In cities, signs were painted on walls. "Don't believe the lies. There is no famine. Work brings bread. Saboteurs starve because they resist. And still the dying kept writing. Notes buried in pockets, messages hidden in shoes, last words carved into the walls of abandoned homes. A young girl from Dnipro left a line scrawled on the inside of a closet door. I dreamed of a white room with bread. No one found her body. When death becomes ordinary, the mind adapts. That was the final transformation in Ukraine during the famine. Not just the breakdown of the body, but the erosion of reality itself. People no longer asked, "Why is this happening?" They asked only, "How do I make it to tomorrow?" And for many the answer was, forget. Forget the rules that once defined civilization. Forget the names of those already gone. Forget the idea of a future. Some children stopped speaking altogether. Others laughed when told that food once came from stores. When they saw a picture of a loaf of bread, they stared at it like a fairy tale. Hunger has stages. At first it's just pain, a gnawing discomfort. You think constantly about food. You dream about bread, about the crunch of a crust, or the softness of a boiled potato. You'd give anything for it. But then comes the second stage, numbness. The stomach stops growling. Your thoughts slow, muscles weaken. You move less, speak less, think less. The body begins to feed on itself, and then comes the collapse. By late 1932, across Ukraine, millions of bodies were entering that final stage. There are photographs, children so emaciated they look like scarecrows in school uniforms, their heads too large for their frames, their arms like twigs. Entire villages sat in silence, not from discipline, but from defeat. Nobody begged anymore. They simply waited. One Soviet official described walking into a rural hut. Inside were 2 parents and 3 children, all dead. Except the mother. She was still alive, cradling the body of her youngest. She had gone blind from malnutrition, she whispered. I thought he moved. This was not isolated. These were not pockets of hunger. This was national policy turned into mass extinction. The countryside began to rot. Not just physically, but morally. People began to do things they could not later explain. A father in Vinnytsia confessed to smothering his infant, not because he was angry, but because the baby wouldn't stop crying. The sound, he said, was drawing attention, and he had no food to give her. Another account, a man buried his wife. 3 days later, he dug her up and ate her. When asked why, he replied, "She wouldn't have wanted me to die too." And beneath it all, the terror continued. Because cannibalism was punishable by death. Yes, even when it was caused by the state. Thousands were arrested for antisocial acts. The Soviet Union would not feed its people, but it would execute them for surviving. Imagine the horror of a regime that first starves you, and then declares your hunger a crime. Even the local authorities were collapsing. Some NKVD agents reported psychological breakdowns. Men ordered to enforce quotas began to drink themselves into stupor. Others tried to flee their posts. A few wrote anonymous letters begging the Central Committee to stop. But nothing stopped. Not when mothers ate their own children. Not when villages vanished without trace. Not even when grain stockpiles sat locked behind guarded doors, full and forbidden. By spring of 1933, parts of rural Ukraine resembled post-apocalyptic ruins. Villages were quiet not because of fear, but because no one was left to speak. Roads were covered in bodies, too weak to bury themselves. Dogs and birds had vanished months ago. Fields stood untouched, not for lack of tools, but for lack of people to hold them. Even the party officials, though still enforcing quotas, began to change. Some filed blank reports, some forged numbers, others sent desperate coded telegrams to higher offices, trying to explain what they were seeing without using forbidden words. No one replied. One worker stationed in Zaporizhia described seeing 2 children curled up on a bench near a bread factory. They had died in their sleep. Their stomachs were distended. Their eyes were open. He stood for an hour, unsure of what to do. Then he walked away, because grief requires hope, and hope had been murdered. Some Ukrainians began to keep secret ledgers, tiny notebooks, hidden beneath floorboards or wrapped in cloth, where they recorded the names of the dead in their village, not for vengeance, not even for justice, but because someone had to remember. One such ledger, discovered decades later in a collapsed barn, had this line scrawled at the back: "If no one remembers us, we were never alive." But that was exactly what the regime wanted. It wasn't just death, it was erasure. By mid-1933, the famine had reached its peak. There was no more shock, no more outrage, no more resistance. Entire districts in Ukraine had collapsed into a trance of death. Skeletons walking past skeletons, mothers sitting beside dead children for days because there was nowhere to bury them and no strength left to try. In many places, work had stopped altogether. The collective farms were empty, the equipment rusted, the harvest never planted, and yet local officials continued to file glowing reports. Quotas met, productivity high, socialist values intact. It was all fiction. What remained on the ground was horror. In one small town near Mykolaiv, a group of orphans, fewer than 10 years old, were found living in a pigsty, eating clay mixed with water. Their parents were gone. No one knew how long they had survived that way. One child tried to speak when officials found them. He collapsed mid-sentence and died before they could record his name. In Kherson, witnesses later described houses where doors were nailed shut from the outside. Entire families had been sealed in, already too weak to move. Their neighbors had done it, not out of cruelty, but because the smell of rot and the sound of moaning had become unbearable. It was a mercy, they said. This was what society looked like after the collapse of food, trust, and truth. And still, grain was being exported. The government reported a bumper harvest. Trains left Ukrainian soil filled with wheat bound for sale overseas. Foreign diplomats were shown these figures. They nodded, took photos, attended state dinners. No one asked what price had been paid for these shipments. No one saw the cost in bones. Some did speak out. Quietly. A few low-ranking officials wrote anonymous appeals. Students in Lviv painted graffiti calling it what it was: genocide. One was caught. He was 16. He died in prison that same year. Meanwhile, Moscow moved forward. The famine, though never declared, was beginning to end. Not through relief, but through reduction. There were simply fewer mouths left to feed. Ukraine had been depopulated, millions dead. The survivors too traumatized to rebel, too broken to remember, and for Stalin, that was enough. When the famine finally began to recede, the silence did not. The deaths had been colossal, millions gone in under 2 years, but Stalin's government had no intention of acknowledging them. Instead, it moved swiftly to erase the memory of what had happened. The first step was paper. The 1937 census, which revealed a catastrophic population drop in Ukraine, was immediately declared falsified. The men who compiled it are trained demographers, statisticians, civil servants, were arrested. Many were executed. The data was destroyed. The Soviet people were told the census had been sabotaged by enemies of the state. From then on, population figures were doctored. The second step was fear. Survivors were not allowed to speak. In public, famine was never mentioned. In schools, children were taught that the 1930s had been a time of heroic growth. The story was one of triumph, of tractors, factories, steel, and victory over backwardness. If you whispered the truth, you could be arrested. If you wrote it down, it would never be published. If you asked where your village had gone, you were told to focus on the future. And the third step was replacement. The famine was over, but the silence was just beginning. In official Soviet history, the 1930s were portrayed as a golden age of progress, collectivization, and the building of a mighty socialist state. Statues were raised to the planners, streets were renamed, cities modernized, and the fields where millions had died were plowed over. But memory does not obey law. It survives in fragments, unmarked, underground, whispered between generations. And in Ukraine, that memory burned quietly in the hearts of the survivors. They passed it to their children, not in classrooms, not in books, but in kitchens, in bedtime stories, in the moments between fear and forgetting. One elderly woman later recalled how her grandmother taught her to never throw away a crumb of bread, and how she was told, even as a child, never to say the word famine outside the house. Others wrote in secret. In the 1950s and 60s, Ukrainian poets and novelists began to slip coded references into their work. Stories about a long winter or a village that vanished carried meanings the censors didn't always catch. Some kept diaries their whole lives, not for publication, not even for anyone to read, but to affirm this happened. Ukrainians in the diaspora, those who had fled to Canada, the US, and elsewhere, also began to speak out. They held conferences, published survivor accounts, held remembrance events in churches and community halls. But even then, the world was slow to listen. The Cold War made truth difficult. Any criticism of the Soviet Union was dismissed by some as Western propaganda, and many academics, still swayed by leftist idealism or Soviet influence, refused to believe the scale of the famine, if they acknowledged it at all. Still, the voices continued. A man in his 80s, interviewed in 1980, said this: "They tried to take the food from our mouths. Then they tried to take the words from our mouths. But we kept one thing, the will to remember. And that will was growing, quietly, steadily, waiting for the day it could speak aloud. While Ukraine starved, the world looked away, but not because it didn't know, because it chose not to see. During the peak of the Holodomor, grain exports from the Soviet Union continued without interruption. Western ships docked in Soviet ports. Diplomats toured factories. Foreign communists visited model villages that had been cleaned and staged like theater sets. In 1933, the Soviet Union was seen not as a genocidal state, but as an emerging superpower. The most influential foreign voice at the time was Walter Duranty, the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize winner, fluent in Russian, connected to officials at the highest levels. He had heard the rumors. He had seen the dying, and still, he wrote, "There is no actual starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. It was a lie, a deliberate one. Duranty wasn't just wrong. He was complicit in shaping Western understanding of the Soviet Union for over a decade. His reports calmed fears, quieted protests, and gave Stalin cover to continue. Why did he do it? Some say he believed in the Soviet experiment. Others say he feared being expelled from Moscow. Still others believe he made a cynical calculation. Access to power was more valuable than truth. Whatever the reason, the damage was done. His reports were read in Washington, in London, in Paris. They were cited in debates, referenced in editorials. They helped delay international condemnation and ensured no humanitarian intervention would come. Meanwhile, the real journalists, those who told the truth, were silenced. Gareth Jones, the young Welsh investigator who walked through famine-struck villages and described what he saw, was publicly mocked after publishing his findings, accused of exaggeration, shunned by peers. In 1935, 2 years after exposing the famine, he was kidnapped and murdered in Inner Mongolia. Some believe Soviet agents orchestrated the killing. There were others like him, fewer and fewer. Because telling the truth about Ukraine in the 1930s wasn't just unpopular, it was dangerous. By 1933, starvation wasn't just a byproduct of policy, it was policy. But what made the Holodomor so uniquely horrifying wasn't only the scale of suffering. It was the way it was managed, organized, filed, approved. Mass death became paperwork. Party officials across Ukraine were given quotas, not just for grain collection, but for arrests, deportations, and executions. When those quotas weren't met, they were increased. Targets had to be fulfilled regardless of conditions. One internal report stated, "The district has not delivered its grain. The blame lies with sabotage. Recommend stronger disciplinary action." Disciplinary action meant more seizures, more blacklists, more arrests, more death. The process was not chaotic. It was efficient, mechanized, systemic. Village leaders who refused to carry out orders were replaced or imprisoned themselves. Local enforcers were trained to monitor everything: seed use, livestock numbers, cooking fires, even the smell of food. Entire regions were under surveillance. And behind the scenes, the state kept meticulous records, detailed lists of how much grain had been confiscated from each family, notes on who cried during raids, reports on suspicious behavior, like a mother boiling water more than once a day. That meant she had something to cook, which meant she was hiding food. Even the dead were categorized. Bodies were counted, but only unofficially. If a region's reported death toll became suspiciously high, the numbers were corrected downward. One local committee head received a reprimand for filing excessively pessimistic mortality figures. He corrected them. On paper, death was receding. In reality, death was all there was. The administrators didn't wear masks. They didn't always act with hatred. Most believed they were simply doing their jobs, feeding the revolution, fulfilling their duty. That was perhaps the most terrifying part, the calm professionalism of annihilation. It didn't take bloodthirsty monsters to kill millions. It took men with pencils, deadlines, and orders to follow. The Holodomor didn't just target the body. It went deeper, into the soul of Ukraine itself. The famine was physical, but the war behind it was cultural. Throughout the early 1930s, Stalin's regime began dismantling Ukrainian identity brick by brick. Schools that once taught in Ukrainian were forced to switch to Russian. Textbooks were rewritten, folk songs, literature, and church sermons were censored, forbidden, or quietly replaced. The countryside, once filled with Orthodox parishes and local traditions, became sanitized. Priests were arrested or disappeared. Holidays tied to agriculture or faith were banned. In their place, Soviet celebrations were introduced, state-planned pageants glorifying the collective, the party, and the future. This was not assimilation. It was replacement. Even names were changed. Towns were renamed to honor Soviet officials, streets rededicated to ideology, generations of history wiped from signage, maps, and memory. Survivors of the famine learned quickly, speak only Russian in public, never mention the hunger, never ask about the past. Children grew up without grandparents, without photos, without graves to visit. In villages, the elderly pointed to empty fields and said, "We don't talk about those days." And so they didn't. This silence was not passive, it was enforced. Writers who spoke of the famine were censored or killed. Teachers who mentioned it were fired. Even in private diaries, people avoided the word holod, hunger. It was safer to say, the hard time. The year of silence, when we ate grass. As the years passed, the survivors began to question their own memories. Was it really that bad? Did that many die? Why didn't anyone say anything? That was the regime's final weapon, doubt. Because if you can't name what happened to you, if no one else remembers, if there's no word for your suffering, then maybe it didn't happen at all. And that is how a nation dies without a gunshot. For decades, the Holodomor existed only in shadows. Soviet textbooks made no mention of famine. Newspapers described the 1930s as a triumph of collectivization. Maps erased depopulated villages. Archives were sealed or destroyed. But silence can't hold forever. It cracks. And the first fractures came from those who had nothing left to lose. In the 1960s, a handful of Ukrainian writers, known as the 60ers, began to challenge the state narrative through art, poetry, and theater. They didn't name the famine outright. That would have meant prison. Instead, they used metaphors, quiet grief, the sound of an empty table, a field where only bones grow. The censors noticed. Many were blacklisted, some arrested, a few disappeared, but their work spread underground, copied by hand, passed from village to village like forbidden scripture. Outside the Soviet Union, the diaspora was louder. In Canada, the United States, and parts of Europe, Ukrainian immigrants who had fled the famine began to speak out. They published memoirs, held public forums, created exhibits with grain sacks, peasant clothing, and photographs of ghost villages. Still, many dismissed it. The Cold War colored everything. To some, stories of famine were just more anti-communist propaganda. Even Western academics hesitated. It wasn't until the 1980s that real momentum built, thanks in part to defection, archival leaks, and the bravery of historians willing to confront decades of lies. In 1984, the U.S. Congress created a commission to investigate the famine. Survivors testified, documents were examined, and the conclusion was clear. Stalin and those around him committed genocide against the Ukrainian people in 1932 to 1933. It was one of the first official recognitions of what survivors had always known. But even then, inside the Soviet Union, it remained unspoken. Only when the empire itself began to collapse did the word resurface inside Ukraine. Holodomor, a name for the hunger, a word for the wound. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, it didn't just collapse borders, it released ghosts. In newly independent Ukraine, long-sealed archives were opened. Former officials spoke, some reluctantly, some defiantly. And for the first time in nearly 60 years, the Holodomor was discussed on Ukrainian soil, not as rumor, not as myth, but as history. The truth was staggering. Entire villages had been erased from records. Blacklists had been stored in locked cabinets. Reports marked top secret documented grain seizures down to the kilogram and arrests for thefts as small as a handful of potatoes. Researchers uncovered execution orders signed in bulk, whole communities labeled hostile and condemned. But the most haunting discoveries were made not on paper, but in the ground. Mass graves, thousands of them, fields where bones lay scattered just beneath the surface, communal burial pits, often shallow and unmarked. In some villages, locals came forward, old men and women who had never spoken a word about what they'd seen, but who now pointed to empty spaces behind barns, schoolyards, and wells. They remembered the wagons, the smell, the silence that followed, and with that memory came rage. For the first time, monuments were built, churches held memorial services, schools began to teach the truth. Survivors were invited to speak. A candle was lit each year to remember the lost. But it was not simple, because truth doesn't heal on its own. It wounds first. It reopens questions. Why didn't anyone stop it? Why did the world stay silent? Why did the killers go unpunished? These questions didn't lead to peace. They led to division. Even in independent Ukraine, there were debates, especially in the eastern regions, over whether the famine had truly been a genocide or simply a tragedy caused by mismanagement. But for those who had buried their children in 1933, the answer had never changed. They didn't need legal definitions. They had lived it. The Holodomor is not just history. It is politics, it is identity, and it is conflict. In the years following independence, Ukraine moved to reclaim what had been buried. In 2006, its parliament officially recognized the famine as genocide. Museums were established, survivors honored. A national day of remembrance declared. But as Ukraine asserted this truth, the pushback began. Russia, heir to the Soviet archives and global influence, rejected the term genocide. Its officials admitted that the famine had occurred, but denied that it targeted Ukrainians specifically. They pointed to famine in other parts of the USSR, claimed mismanagement, drought, even bad luck, but not intent, not extermination. And so the debate turned from mourning to politics. Some countries, Canada, the United States, several in Europe, recognized the Holodomor as genocide. Others, fearing diplomatic backlash or economic ties to Moscow, used softer terms: tragedy, famine, mistake. Meanwhile, Ukraine found itself split, especially in regions with deeper Soviet roots. Some schools taught the Holodomor as genocide, others did not. Some politicians spoke of it with reverence, others ignored it entirely. But for the survivors and their descendants, it was never about international law. It was about acknowledgement that what they saw, the silence, the hunger, the disappearance of their villages, was real, deliberate, and remembered. A young activist in Kyiv once said during a commemoration, "If you control the past, you control the future. But we remember, and we are not asking permission to mourn." The Holodomor became more than a historical wound. It became a symbol of Ukraine's struggle for sovereignty, of its right to define its own suffering, speak its own language, bury its own dead. And in the 21st century, as new conflicts unfolded, the memory of 1933 would rise again, no longer as a secret, but as a warning. What happens when the dead are never buried properly? What happens when an entire generation disappears, not with monuments, but with silence? You get a nation built on unmarked graves. Across Ukraine, thousands of burial sites remain undocumented. Some are remembered by elders. Others lie beneath highways, construction zones, farmland, plowed over again and again with no sign to mark the bones below. And yet, they are still there. In the early 2000s, teams of volunteers began working with historians and survivors to locate these mass graves. Using testimonies, declassified maps, and ground-penetrating radar, they began to mark what had once been forbidden. Here stood a village destroyed by famine. Here, a pit where children were buried. Here, the cost of silence. For some, the work is sacred. For others, it is too painful. Many families still do not know where their relatives lie. No grave, no death certificate, no final word. Just a gap where a life should have been. Some graves are now marked with small crosses, others with candles lit each November during the annual day of mourning. But the soil itself, rich, dark, and fertile, is forever haunted, because the wheat still grows. That's the most disturbing part. The land that fed an empire is the same land that starved its people. The grain fields of Ukraine, praised for their abundance, have long hidden their curse. And each harvest is a ghost story. Beneath every stalk, someone once died for it. This is not metaphor, it is reality, and the survivors know it. An old man tending a memorial garden once told a visiting journalist, "When I plant potatoes, I speak to them. I say, 'I'm sorry, I am not them. I will not steal you. I will not kill for you.'" Then he planted in silence. The Holodomor ended in 1933, but its shadow never left. You can see it in the homes of survivors' children, where every crumb of bread is saved, every jar is cleaned and reused, every dinner served with quiet gratitude. You can hear it in their voices, soft, cautious, wary of saying too much. You can feel it in their hesitation when asked about the past. Because trauma doesn't die with the body, it's passed on. Psychologists call it intergenerational transmission of trauma, when the pain of one generation shapes the behavior and psychology of the next, even without explanation, even in silence. Children of famine survivors report chronic anxiety, guilt over wasting food, hypervigilance in times of crisis. Some avoid asking their parents about their childhoods, not because they aren't curious, but because they know the answers are unbearable. One Ukrainian writer described his grandfather's habit of hiding bread under his pillow every night. Even in his 80s, even with full cupboards, he couldn't sleep without it. He never explained why, the writer said, but he didn't have to. This inheritance is invisible. There are no medals, no state recognition, just the quiet continuation of fear. For decades, entire families lived with the knowledge that something terrible had happened, but without the words to describe it. Grandmothers wept during certain months. Fathers drank in silence on November evenings. Children learned not to ask. It wasn't denial, it was survival. And even today, that silence echoes. You hear it in the way some Ukrainians hesitate to speak about politics, in the reverence with which food is handled, in the shame that lingers, inexplicably, in homes touched by famine generations ago. Because when a crime is denied long enough, its victims begin to question whether they were allowed to grieve. And that, too, is a form of violence. There are places where memory must be built from nothing. No photos, no graves, no documents, only pain passed down through whisper and ritual. That was the task Ukraine faced after independence, to reclaim a past that had been systematically erased. It began with stories. In the 1990s and early 2000s, survivors were interviewed, filmed, recorded, often for the first and last time. Their accounts were gathered by historians, activists, and descendants desperate to preserve what little remained. Then came the monuments. Across Ukraine, new memorials rose in villages and cities alike. Not grand, not ornate, just stark stone, silent fields, sheaves of wheat carved in mourning. The most famous stands in Kiev: the Holodomor Memorial, a black spire beside a candle-shaped tower, guarded by a statue of a starving girl clutching a few stalks of grain. She doesn't speak, she doesn't cry, she just stands there, watching. Inside, the museum holds fragments, letters, confiscation orders, ration cards, peasant tools, photos of faces that vanished. There are maps showing where grain was taken and where the dead were buried. There are recordings, a woman describing how her brother's legs swelled from hunger, a man who buried his neighbors in secret, one by one, for fear of arrest, a teacher who watched half her students die before spring. Outside, every November, candles are lit in windows across the country, one candle for each home that starved in silence. But remembering is not enough. Ukraine has pushed for global recognition, asking nations around the world to name the Holodomor for what it was: genocide. Some have. Others hesitate, caught between diplomacy and denial. Still others ignore it completely. Yet the campaign continues, because every statue built, every archive opened, every child taught the truth, is one more nail in the coffin of silence. And silence is what let the famine happen. What do you call it when millions die from starvation, not by natural disaster, not by war, but by deliberate policy? Some call it a tragedy. Others call it a crime against humanity. Ukraine calls it genocide. The word matters, because genocide isn't just about numbers. It's about intent. Not only to destroy lives, but to destroy identity. In 1948, the UN Genocide Convention defined genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. By that definition, Ukraine argues, the Holodomor qualifies. The state didn't merely starve people, it starved Ukrainians, their language suppressed, their churches dismantled, their history rewritten, their land resettled. And the result? A shattered nation, a stolen memory, a death toll beyond reckoning. As of now, over 30 countries officially recognize the Holodomor as genocide, including the United States, Canada, and most of Eastern Europe. Others, like the United Kingdom and Germany, stop short, calling it a consequence of Stalinist policies or a grave tragedy, but not genocide. Russia, the successor state of the USSR, vehemently denies the label. It argues that the famine affected other regions too, Kazakhstan, parts of Russia, and that no specific ethnic group was targeted. It accuses Ukraine of politicizing history, and in recent years, it has actively suppressed discussion of the Holodomor within its own borders. So who decides? Historians, politicians, survivors? For many, the answer doesn't lie in legal definitions, but in lived experience. A woman once told a journalist, "I don't need a word to tell me what happened. I lived through it. They wanted us gone, that's all. Yet for a country trying to reclaim its truth, the word genocide is more than accurate. It's necessary. Because if you remove the label, you soften the crime. And if you soften the crime, you allow it to happen again. History never stays history. It returns, in language and politics, in silence, repeated. And in Ukraine, the Holodomor returned not as memory, but as warning. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. In the years that followed, conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine, an invasion masked as rebellion, backed by denial, waged not only on land but on identity. Once again, questions of language, culture, and sovereignty took center stage, and once again, food became a battlefield. In 2022, as full-scale war engulfed Ukraine, millions were displaced. Grain exports were blocked, storage facilities bombed, farmlands burned. Ukrainian officials and international observers alike began to echo a chilling phrase: "This is a war on food." In the same wheat fields where peasants once starved under Stalin, artillery craters now bloomed. In the same Black Sea ports where grain was once stolen by the state, ships were now turned away or destroyed. And in Kiev, candles still burned for the Holodomor. Not just in remembrance, but in recognition that the logic behind famine, the logic of domination, of identity, erased through starvation, is not confined to history. It survives, not just in wars, but in disinformation, in denial, in the refusal to listen to those who survived, in the hesitation of the world to name what it sees, even now. The Holodomor was not just an event, it was a blueprint. And every time a nation is starved into submission, every time silence is weaponized, every time the truth is rewritten to serve power, that blueprint is followed. Which is why the candles still burn, why the graves still whisper, why the story still matters. There is no ending to the Holodomor. Not really. Because even now, its echoes linger across landscapes, in family trees, in the pauses between generations where truth should live, but doesn't. Every unmarked grave is a sentence that never finished. Every erased name, a history that was stolen. And yet the survivors spoke anyway. Not in speeches, not in protests, but in small, brave acts of memory. A grandmother passing down a recipe her mother used before the hunger. A schoolteacher daring to tell students about a village that no longer exists. A historian risking her life to write the word Holodomor in ink, not whisper. And you, listening now, are part of that act. Because to hear this story, to truly sit with it, is to do what millions were never allowed to do. Remember, this was not a famine. It was not an accident. It was not a tragedy of numbers. It was a weapon. And those who built it knew exactly what they were doing. They tried to erase the dead. They failed. Because the fields still speak. The bones still rest uneasy. And the truth, though buried, refuses to die. You've made it to the end of this story. But for these who lived it, there was no neat conclusion, no reckoning, no justice. Just memory. And the hope that someone someday would listen. Tonight, you did.